And we should be live. Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm Thoughtful Money founder and your host, Adam Taggart, welcoming you here for a special report on the action that's been going on in Venezuela this week. We're very fortunate to be joined again by RANE Latin America geopolitical analyst, Mario Braga. Mario, thank you so much for taking the time in what I'm sure must be a very busy time for you to talk to the Thoughtful Money audience.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in the show.
All right. Well, look, Mario, for those that didn't see it, you were kind enough to come on about a month ago or so and update us on the situation in Venezuela. This was right as the U.S. was starting to really build up its naval blockade of the country. We talked about kind of the history of how things got to the point in Venezuela where they were being run by Maduro and the infrastructure was, failing and 8 million people had fled the country and all that stuff. So folks, if you want a deep dive kind of in the history of how Venezuela got to where it is today, go back and listen to that special report. We talked about the odds of the U.S. forcibly deposing Maduro, and correct me if I'm misremembering here, Mario, but it sounded like at that time that was sort of the lower probability option that RANE thought was going to happen. They thought it was going to be more, targeted strikes on cartel assets and things like that, but just putting more military pressure on Maduro and maybe trying to negotiate, some sort of compliance from him. But not necessarily, in a military excursion to forcibly remove him from power. That turned out to be what happened. So what we're going to talk about today is, okay, so now that we've pulled the leader out of Venezuela, one, if you could just give us sort of a quick snapshot on what exactly the state of affairs is right now. And then I'd like to talk with you about sort of all the implications of this, what's going to happen in terms of who's going to lead Venezuela, how sticky of an issue could this become for the U.S., what the impact's going to be geopolitically, how the rest of the world is reacting to this. Economically, does this mean big things for the energy markets or other parts of the global economy? So we'll get into all those. And then folks, the last time with Mario, we pre-recorded it. This is a live stream, so I want to leave some generous time here for audience questions as well. So Mario, I guess just to sort of start things off, what is the current state of play right now with Venezuela?
Sure. Thanks again, Adam. So basically what we had is that on Saturday, the 3rd of January, we had the U.S. carry out a military and law enforcement operation, as the Trump administration has been framing it, to not only carry out strikes in Venezuela, mostly around the capital Caracas, but also to capture and extract then President Nicolás Maduro. He was then taken to the U.S. and is now facing charges. What that consists of, what kind of the results of that is that you had a power vacuum in Venezuela. So who is the president now? Who is going to lead the country? There was a lot of uncertainty over the weekend. But right on Sunday, so on the following day, the Supreme Court ordered that Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, should take up the role of interim president for 90 days.
All right. And I'm sorry, the Supreme Court of the U.S. or of Venezuela? Who wrote this?
The Supreme Court of Venezuela ordered that following the country's constitutional process. But that's not only enough in a country where the military has a strong power. The last time I joined the show, we were discussing the different factions that sustained Maduro in power. And one of them is the armed forces, which are led by Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez. But Venezuela also has a lot of paramilitary forces. It has the Bolivarian militia. It has the armed so-called colectivos, which are civilians that follow orders by Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello. So you had different factions and groups that could fight for power, and this could lead to internal disputes, internal struggles, even an armed conflict. So there was a lot of uncertainty in these initial hours. But after the Venezuelan Supreme Court ordered Delcy to become the interim president, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, issued a statement saying that the armed forces recognized her as the leader of the country. And then from there, you had a slightly less tense and less uncertain, but still highly uncertain scenario. So the state of play is Delcy Rodriguez is now the acting president. She was the vice president under Maduro. And all the apparatus of the regime, so all the ministers, all the kind of these paramilitary forces, they are still in place. So we cannot necessarily talk about regime change just by the removal of Maduro from Caracas and from Venezuela, because all the rest of the government and military structures are still in place. And then we can discuss in detail why that is the case, what seems to be the Trump administration's rationale. But the situation now is that Delcy Rodriguez is the president, and it seems that there have been conversations between her and the Trump administration on how things should proceed from now on.
Okay. So I think a question that a lot of people have is, all right, so as we understand it, Venezuela held elections, I can't remember when, a year or two ago. Pardon me?
July 2024.
Okay, July 2024. And Maduro did not win, but he held on to power anyways. And the party or the person who won was this woman, I'm forgetting her first name, but Machado was her last name. Folks might recognize the name because she was the person who won the Nobel Peace Prize a few months back. And so she was sort of a leader in exile, right? And she has a guy, I can't remember his name, I'm sure you'll share it with us, who's kind of her proxy inside the country. And she is, has been working with the rest of the global community, as you shared with us last time, she's got a very detailed plan about how Venezuela should be run, and it could re-engage much more with the global economy and be a lot more friendly to a lot of other countries. And they've got a game plan for that she's been selling. I think a lot of people thought, okay, well, gosh, the Trump administration is just going to put her in power and hand the torch to her. But Trump said, no, she doesn't have the support inside the country. And that surprised a lot of people. I'd love to hear your explanation as to why you think the administration is not choosing her. Just to tack onto that question, last time you were here, you explained again the history of how Maduro rose to power within Venezuela. And as part of that process, he was Chavez's successor. And during both the Chavez regime and the Maduro regime, they basically stacked the entire deck in the power structure of the country with their cronies. So everybody in the political system, everybody in the military, everybody in the judiciary, everybody in the local police forces. And you had said it's tough to force regime change on the country, because if you remove the head of the snake, you still have the whole rest of the snake that's aligned with kind of the Maduro way of doing things. And so was part of Trump's decision was, hey, I can't just remove one head and put a different head on it because it's got a snake body that's going to reject it.
Yeah, you're right, Adam. That's the rationale behind what seems to be the decision-making process of the Trump administration. So to get the kind of the storyline together, basically, we had in July 2024, the presidential elections in Venezuela, which were part of a broader agreement that the Biden administration was trying to get Maduro on the table with other stakeholders in like Brazil as well, Colombia. There was the Barbados Agreement. Maduro, back in, I think, 2023, late 2023, said, okay, I will hold free and fair elections. The opposition will be able to run. Then we'll see who wins. And in exchange for that, the U.S. would reduce economic sanctions. And that seems to be a way for a transition to democracy, right? Because if you have free and fair elections, the opposition wins, Maduro is out of power. Mm-hmm. But then what happened following this agreement is that Maduro did not deliver. So he try to repress the opposition. He prevented the most popular opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, as you mentioned, who now just won the Nobel Prize. She was barred from running. So what the opposition did was they united behind one of the few single candidates that was still allowed to run, because Maduro thought he was so unpopular that he would never win. That's Edmundo González Urrutia. He was a diplomat, and he was kind of unknown to most Venezuelans. But despite not being on the ticket, Maria Corina Machado ran the campaign. She was going across the country. She gathered large crowds. And most importantly, the opposition managed to have kind of a structure of allies in all the kind of the ballots and the center, so they could get the receipts of the votes. And they proved that the results that Maduro claimed that he had won the election were false, because with the receipts they were able to show that in fact González Urrutia got 67% of the vote. But as you mentioned, Maduro controls the entire apparatus, the government, the electoral bodies, the judiciary, the military. So the official version that he had won prevailed. He remained in power, taking office in January 2025. And in this mindset of an authoritarian regime with repression, González Urrutia fled to Spain. He was recognized as president-elect, but he left the country. And Maria Corina Machado remained in hiding in Venezuela up until late 2025, when she left the country to the Nobel ceremony in Norway, in Oslo. Now the two of them are outside the country, so you don't have an opposition leader in Venezuela. And when we focus on what was the Trump decision-making process, there are reports, media reports, showing that the CIA assessed the scenario. And if you have the option of having Maria Corina Machado, who is friendly to the US, she was proposing the privatization of state-owned companies. She was proposing opening up the oil and gas sector. She was talking about 1.7 trillion investment opportunity over 10 to 30 years. So she was friendly. But the question was, would she be able to deliver? We're talking about a country, as I said before, in which the armed forces play a strong role, in which you have paramilitary forces. And Maria Corina Machado, although she's popular among the population, she does not control or have influence over these other parts of the state. So the assessment seems to be that, well, if we remove Maduro and we make right away a transition to democracy in which we recognize the 2024 election results, in which González Urrutia takes office and Maria Corina is a strong kind of stakeholder within this government, they would highly likely be challenged by the security apparatus. This could lead, as I said before, a lot of instability, a lot of uncertainty. There could be a coup to oust them. There could be an internal armed conflict. There could be a highly uncertain environment that is not favorable to businesses. And it seems that the Trump administration for now has prioritized, as we saw in President Trump's statements, the opportunities that the Venezuelan oil sector can provide. So instead, the calculation was, well, we can remove Maduro, and now he's in the US, he'll face charges. We'll leave the entire apparatus in place, because this is an apparatus that, although has not been friendly to the US, it gets the state running, right? So things are under control. There was a severe economic decline that led to the immigration of millions of Venezuelans, like nearly 8 million since 2016. But the rationale is, if they are there, and because the US has the naval buildup in the Caribbean, a lot of kind of military personnel deployed, because they have carried out the operation that extracted Maduro, they have the leverage to pressure the new government to play ball, to appease and meet Washington's demands. So it seems that now their preferred path was, we keep things in place and we get them, the new government, to play by our rules or our interests or our demands. And this is what we have seen in recent days. And because, just to wrap this part, on the Venezuelan side, you have like Delcy Rodriguez. She's a loyal to the socialist revolution. She has been in positions in the government since 2003 under former President Hugo Chavez. She has made a lot of strong criticisms to the U.S. She has said that Venezuela will not be a colony. It's now, like after the extraction of Maduro, she demanded Maduro's release. But all of them, not only her, the high-ranking officials in the government and in the military, they are afraid that what happened to Maduro could happen to them.
Right.
They are afraid that if the regime collapses, they would face charges both in Venezuela and or in the US for illegal activities, illegal drug trafficking, for human rights violations, even for terrorism. So for them now, the calculation is, well, maybe it's better for us to cooperate with Washington and prevent the regime from falling than the other option that would be a democratic transition. They get voted out, and then they would face the consequences. So that's kind of how things seem to be placed to play out in the coming weeks and months.
Okay, so to continue to murder my analogy, rather than chop the head off the snake, graft a brand new head on it, and then risk the body of the snake rejecting the new head and Venezuela descending into kind of Lord of the Flies, failed state territory. Instead, we said, okay, look, we're going to keep the whole snake in place, minus Maduro, but we're going to put our hand firmly around its neck and squeeze and say, snake, you're going to do what I tell you to do. And it seems like the main levers there are, okay, we're now taking over your oil infrastructure. So if you want to continue to get revenue from your own oil industry, it's going to come through us. We can turn it on, we can turn it off. And then secondly, missiles and special forces. You saw what happened to Maduro. You do something we don't like, you might be the next one pulled out in a midnight raid, or you might just find a missile in your bedroom, right? So you're nodding here, but that's pretty much the control mechanism we now have or the U.S. now has in place over Venezuela.
Yeah, it's basically an option for some sort of coercion, right? Because on Saturday, on the same day of the operation, President Trump gave a press conference, and then he said the U.S. will run Venezuela. And then a lot of people were asking, okay, how will that play out? Will he appoint, for example, Marco Rubio to be in charge? And later, what we had, even statements from Rubio himself, is that will not be kind of an official position that the U.S. will become kind of a governing Venezuela, but that the U.S. officials, the Trump administration, will, and then air quotes, like work closely with Caracas, with the new government, Delcy Rodriguez, the new president, so the new government adopts policies that are aligned with what the White House thinks should be the priorities for Caracas. And then there have been media reports since the weekend that give a hint on what we can expect to be these priorities. So I'm just going to refer to some of the notes that I have here.
Okay. But and while you're plugging them up, let me just ask this. So it kind of sounds like the U.S. or the administration's coterie, whoever's going to be tasked with this, Rubio and others, they're going to be like a board of directors. And they're essentially going to give the president the marching orders. Okay, this is the strategic direction. These are the policies we want. And they want her to say, okay, got it, boss. I'm going to go execute.
Yeah, informally, that's the design. And that's what we expect Delcy Rodriguez to do. And that's still to be seen if that will actually work. But from media reports, what we have is that so far in these background conversations, government officials from the United States have outlined three main priorities for the new president of Venezuela. The first is fight drug trafficking. We know this has been a major priority across Latin America. The second is removing from Venezuela operatives from countries that are hostile to the US. So Iran and Cuba, namely, but from other countries as well. We know, as we discussed the first time I was on the show, that Cuba runs the counterintelligence services in Venezuela, that 32 Cubans and kind of officials died because they were basically the bodyguards of Maduro. So there are operatives from Iran, from Cuba there. Washington wants them out. And then the third priority is to stop the shipment of oil to countries that are adversaries to the US. And that can include also Cuba, because the Venezuelan oil provides the lifeline to the Cuban regime. But a lot of Venezuelan oil also goes to China, for example. It accounts for 4% of China's oil imports. So, of course, China can still get this oil from elsewhere, but that's still a disruption. So these are the three top priorities. And then later, what we had is that yesterday, President Trump announced on Truth Social a deal, and this has not been confirmed from the Venezuelan side, but basically Trump said that Venezuela will turn over between 30 million and 50 million barrels of oil. This would be worth between $2 billion and $2.8 billion. Basically, the US would get this oil, would sell at market price, and would put this the proceeds in a fund that would be run by the US government. And then when Trump posted it, he said that the proceeds would be used to the benefit of the people of both countries. And then later we had, just a couple of hours ago, Energy Secretary Chris Wright saying, kind of confirming this, that there would be a structure, a fund to which the revenue would go, and it would be used in favor of Venezuela. So it's still uncertain how this will actually play out, and if Caracas will confirm this deal, but there are steps that are indicating how the situation is likely to evolve.
Okay. And that sounds kind of like classic Trump of like, hey, whatever costs the U.S. might endure from getting involved in Venezuela, the Venezuelans are going to pay for it, right? Mm-hmm. It'll be funded by Venezuela's own oil. Yeah. Okay, so let's see here. So with Machado, the thought was, hey, we don't want to put her in too soon and have the whole system reject her. So presumably the country's going to have elections, right? That presumably that's a big priority of the U.S. is hey, let's get democratic elections held at some point soon, and then eventually a democratically elected leader will get in, and then they'll be able to continue to drive these reforms. Why do they think putting in a democratic leader in the future versus now will work any differently? Is that because they want time to kind of force, by choking the snake to kind of, foam the runway for the new leader? Are they trying to give everybody who's kind of in power right now and afraid of what would happen if government changes, because all of a sudden there's a target on their back? Is it just to give them time to kind of decide, hey, what country do I want to escape to? Why should we expect a democratic leader, if they're put in 3 months or 6 months or whatever, to be any more successful than if they put Machado in today?
Yeah, it's hard to tell exactly what went on in this decision and kind of the different drivers that influenced it. So I can't really say that there is like one single reason or why they prefer this over that. Like the broader rationale, as I said before, is that they opted for what the CIA assessed to be a more stable scenario. And this, of course, according to media reports, that there was a CIA assessment showing that under DLC, she would be more able to keep the state under control, and that would be a more stable scenario. And then there is still an open question of when there will be elections, and even if these elections that are still to be scheduled will be, for example, free and fair, or if the US will be comfortable with the current government again trying to rig the election to stay in power. We still don't know. According to the Venezuelan constitution, when the president is absent and you have a new president, the new president should call elections in 30 days. We have not heard anything so far that would be the case. So it's hard to say that they could call elections in 30 days, but as you said, these could be elections scheduled for the second half of the year. So it's still early days, and we haven't seen the indications that a concrete transition to democracy is actually going to occur. Because there is also the potential scenario in which, as I said before, the current members of the regime, they get too afraid of regime collapse, of U.S. intervention, of another extraction, or U.S. military strikes, and then they just go along with Trump's demands. We anticipate that Delcy Rodriguez will continue to make these harsh speeches, to continue to criticize the Trump administration, but she's not going to cross the line and break these background conversation channels, because that would be too high of a risk. Trump has said that she would pay even a higher price than Maduro did. So there is this constant pressure. And in a scenario in which the new government in Caracas, let's say they meet all of these demands that seem to be on the table, maybe the Trump administration will be comfortable with that. So it's hard to tell how, especially when you think about a longer, we have put out a piece, an analysis for the next 3 to 6 months, because then we have more visibility. Yeah. And one of the scenarios is over the next 3 to 6 months, she can make this very tricky balancing act of appeasing Washington, but at the same time, she cannot displease the hardliners within the regime, for example, because she would risk a coup, a military coup that could try to oust her for being overly friendly to the United States. So it's a very tricky balancing act, and that's why there is also a persistent uncertainty on how things can evolve.
Okay. There's an argument to be made where, Trump may have done this because he sort of says, what's my downside, right? I've got this regime that's thumbing its nose at me and doing all sorts of things I don't want it to do. And it's got, my adversaries, it's opening itself to my adversaries and all that stuff. So let me grab that guy, right? Let me hopefully, scare the country into, or the leadership of the country into towing whatever line I want, and I get, I take over their oil and all that stuff, right? And if they fall into line, great. That's way better than what I had before. If they eventually have democratic elections, whether it's 3 months or 3 years from now, and the country becomes much more democratic and U.S. friendly, even better. But you know what? If the hardliners take out this president and this new president, and they put their own hardliner person in there, it's really no different than what I had before. Right? So you can kind of make the argument there wasn't a lot of downside to this.
Yeah, the operation itself. When we were discussing last time I was on the show about the potential scenarios, as you mentioned earlier, we anticipated that the first strikes, for example, would be on drug trafficking assets, drug camps, like airstrips or ports. And then it's interesting because in late December, there was one of these strikes, a drone strike in Venezuelan territory. But the operation, the extraction itself, showed a much higher risk appetite from the Trump administration, because it's a highly complex military operation with more than 150 kind of aircraft, the different elements involved. They departed from 20 different bases. So this showed that the Trump administration was willing to take a high risk to have the political win of removing Maduro. And that's the kind of perhaps one of the lingering questions, that perhaps that is a victory that's enough for them, at least for now. And then when we think about the longer term, we have to remember Secretary of State Marco Rubio is of Cuban descent. How the situation in Venezuela and broader across Latin America of leftist autocracies, this is something that is a sensitive topic for voters in Florida. So all of these elements will likely become drivers for the future decision making as the situation evolves. We have this year elections for governor and I think for the Senate in Florida as well. So who knows if a stronger approach to Venezuela and perhaps even to Cuba will be something that the administration is willing to do now, or if they will wait past the midterms, and as the presidential election approaches again, they would be more willing again to take more risk to deliver what Latin voters in the US would perceive as a strong victory. So all of these elements need to be taken into consideration when we analyze the kind of the incentives and constraints for the Trump administration.
Okay. It seems that the reaction, at least from the 8 million refugees who left Venezuela, at least from what we see on the mainstream media, very positive. Same within Venezuela?
Yeah, definitely the diaspora, those that have fled the regime for the economic collapse of fear of repression. There were celebrations across like US cities, but across Latin American cities in Spain, where most of these Venezuelans are concentrated in these different countries. What we had in Caracas, in Venezuela, was a much more muted reaction to some extent, in a sense that overnight when they like woke up Saturday morning, what's going on, the fear that there could be more strikes, the fact that since the regime is still in place, the repression apparatus still exists. So you didn't see as many or as large demonstrations in Venezuela. On the contrary, because there is still the regime apparatus, what you had were small demonstrations of what could be described as pro-government protesters. So they were demanding the release of Maduro. They were denouncing U.S. intervention. So that kind of thing happened inside Venezuela. But part of that is because there's still a lot of fear. And then today is Wednesday. Over the past 2-3 days, there are reports that the government is stepping up the crackdown. There seems to be journalists detained. There seems to be the colectivos are on the street harassing people. So it's still an environment of fear inside the country.
Mm-hmm. What does your gut tell you here about the general Venezuelan? Are they excited but just too afraid to show it, or are they affronted that their country's sovereignty was broken?
Yeah, I think a good proxy to understand Venezuelans' take on the regime and the outlook for change is the results that we had in the July 2024 election, right? So back then, 2/3 of Venezuelans voted for the opposition. So it's not an understatement to say that the majority of the population opposes the regime and would like to see regime change. But given what we had was just the removal of the regime leader, Maduro, but the regime is still there, they are not in a position to go out on the streets and demonstrate, or to celebrate, or even to demand the ousting of the new president, right? So, but if you think that that's what the election result was, that there are, yes, kind of more Venezuelans than not that would be happy to see Maduro go.
Okay. In just a second, I'm going to ask about kind of the rest of the world's reaction to this, especially the other countries in South America, one of which you live in right now. Let me just ask you this. So the country lost about 1/5 of its population, right? Those 8 million that left. Do you expect a material amount of those people to start making their way back to Venezuela, either now or after democratic elections, or are those people gone?
Yeah, for now, I don't think that would be the case because, as I said before, the regime is still in place, so they wouldn't go back to the kind of the same situation that they fled initially. I think that if we have a transition to democracy, the opposition wins, it takes office, and then let's say for the first 3 to 6 months, perhaps a year, there is stability, then it's more likely that you will begin to see a return of these immigrants that left the country because of the repression and the economic kind of meltdown and all those kind of negative impacts that we saw over the past 10 years. But I think that it will still take time, and there will likely need to be clear evidence that the situation has changed, that the outlook is positive, that there is room for improvement, economic growth, job generation, because these are people that were starving, actually. Like, you had measures in kind of the crisis so severe that there were indicators showing the average weight loss of people in Venezuela because they don't have access to food. So that's what people fled from, right? So I think they're only going to come back to when they have at least a perception that their lives can get better in Venezuela.
That they'll be able to actually eat, yeah, at least. Do you, I know we're sort of pontificating here, but do you expect, if we get to that stage where the diaspora starts reversing and these people come back in, especially those who have been in wealthier nations, US or some of the other wealthier LATAM countries, do you expect that to be a catalyst for sort of accelerating democratic change inside Venezuela? Because obviously they're coming back because they left because they didn't like the regime. They're coming back having lived in much more open societies, probably enjoying a taste of what they got. Maybe they have more resources as a result too. So, you know, I know it's going to take a while, if never, to get to that stage. But if it were to start to happen, is that something that would be an accelerating for catalytical change?
Yeah, it could be one of the variables, definitely, because when we think even about from the economic side, part of this large kind of immigration amounts to brain drain as well, right? So many Venezuelans that were kind of highly trained, that had degrees, technical degrees for the oil and gas sector, including, they have left the country. So when you bring people back, you have more, all beyond the humanitarian aspect of it, you start to have more kind of resources to rebuild the country. And as you said, you have more and more engaging civil society. You have people demanding transparency, fight corruption. So all of that could indeed help. But again, as you mentioned, I think this is many steps further down the line until we get to that point.
Okay. All right. So we saw that a lot of the Venezuelan refugees celebrating this. How about the rest of South America? I know Maduro wasn't loved. So maybe there's some countries that are happy to get him off the board, but no country likes the thought that, hey, the US could come in and remove me if they all of a sudden decide they don't like me. You live in a country, Brazil, which is kind of on that list. Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, those are kind of the countries that even Trump himself and Rubio have said, yeah, those leaders should probably not be sleeping as well right now. Yeah. So what has the reaction been from the rest of LATAM? And then we'll talk about the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that there is a sense that Maduro was already pretty much isolated, especially following the 2024 presidential elections, because basically no country in the Western Hemisphere acknowledged the results. They did not recognize him as president-elect. But there was that limbo that at the same time that they did not recognize, there was not much that they would do to force him out. There were attempts by Brazil and Colombia to try to negotiate a new election. This did not succeed. So there is a sense that Maduro going is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that the sentiment that prevails is a concern over what the US operation opens a precedent in terms of the violation of the sovereignty of countries in the region, right? Because that was a US unilateral decision to go in, extract him and take to the US. And all of this, the debate that we have in international law, international organisms, is that under international law, countries can only engage in a military action against another country in two situations. One is when they are attacked and then they are just responding. And two, if there is the approval of the United States Security Council. So for example, let's say, oh, there is a genocide in a country anywhere in the world. There is a group that is systematically killing a smaller part of the population. The United States Security Council can authorize the deployment of military troops to prevent that from happening. In this case, the argument is that none of these two situations occurred because there was no United Nations Security Council approval. And there is the argument that Venezuela did not attack the United States. But from the Trump administration, the argument is, well, Venezuela was providing, was a corridor to provide drugs to the United States.
Right.
This was a risk to the national security, and therefore we are in a position to step in. So there are two sides of the argument. When we look from the Latin American countries, the concern is, well, they did this in Venezuela, they might as well just do this in other countries as well. And I think that the two countries that would be on the top of the list for a similar action, not an extraction like Maduro, but airstrikes against drug trafficking sites, would be Colombia, which is the main producer of cocaine in the world. And the fact that, as you mentioned, Colombia has a leftist president who has been a stark critic of President Trump. He has opposed the strikes on boats. He has denounced what he described as the kidnapping of Maduro. Trump and him have exchanged kind of heated public statements. So there is the outlook that there could be drone strikes against drug trafficking sites in Colombia, and to some extent Mexico as well, because Mexico is the main source of fentanyl. So when you think about Colombia, Venezuela, we are talking about cocaine. When you think about Mexico, there's also fentanyl. And in Mexico, President Claudia Sheinbaum has repeatedly said she would oppose any sort of unilateral military intervention. So it's a tricky situation. And then we have to see how it evolves, but it's more likely than not that we'll see some sort of military operation in remote areas of these countries in 2026.
Okay. I'm resisting continuing to go down that thread, but just given the time, I'm going to jump to the rest of the world. So, obviously China, Russia, not thrilled about this for a whole bunch of reasons. And so they've voiced their strong displeasure. Beyond them, how is the rest of the world reacting to this?
Yeah, it's interesting because for both Russia and China, this is a two-edged sword, because Venezuela was an ally. Russia provided arms for decades to Venezuela. Now Venezuela provided oil to China. China lent a lot of money to Venezuela. But if we take a step back and we analyze what this military operation and the extraction of Maduro represents more broadly, it shows that the US is willing to exert strong influence, if not dominion, on the Western Hemisphere. This was outlined in the National Security Strategy, a document that was published late in 2025, that the Trump administration thinks that for national security reasons, Washington needs to have, we can even talk about, like, to some extent, control of the hemisphere, of the Western Hemisphere. That means, or at least suggests, that the US is willing to be less present, in other parts of the globe. And it's more comfortable that other superpowers also exert power in their areas of influence, in their backyard, so to speak. So from that perspective, that's a good thing for Putin in Moscow and in Russia, and for Xi in Beijing in China, because they have military aspirations, as we know, in Ukraine and also in Taiwan. China has long said it aims to unify China, so bring Taiwan under the authority of Beijing. So the precedent that this operation sets is also a positive for them in that regard. And then talking about the world more broadly, I think it goes in line with what we said before, that no one is sad to see Maduro go, so no one is really kind of opposing that aspect. But a lot of countries, especially from Europe, for example, they have underscored the risks of violating international law. Because if you start violating that persistently, you end up in the jungle world, so to speak, right? There are no rules and everyone can do as they please. And then this is not necessarily helpful to the maintenance of the kind of a more stable relation between countries.
Mm-hmm. Now, well, okay. I'm curious, does RANE have an opinion? And let's put good or bad aside for a moment. But if America were to continue to pursue this Monroe Doctrine, maybe Monroe Doctrine on steroids, we really want to, have primacy in the Western Hemisphere. I'm sure U.S. still wants to keep its toehold in a lot of other places still, but hold to them less lightly than we did before, but really lock in the Western Hemisphere, really, exploit all of its resources, protect it with a Golden Dome missile shield. We've got 2 massive oceans on either side. Kind of to your point, we care a little bit less about what happens in the rest of the world as long as we're controlling our hemisphere and running it the way that we want it to. Would that work for America? Like, is that a strategy that would actually make America stronger, safer, et cetera, than it is today?
Yeah, from our analytical perspective, like setting aside if it's like good or bad, when we think about what this can translate in terms of business impacts, it's the kind of thing that you have pros and cons. I think basically like everything, right? Because if you think that there will be this stronger focus on the Western Hemisphere, that the Trump administration will seek to work more closely with, even if just right-wing governments, more allied governments, that would likely create opportunities for U.S. companies. We are seeing at least the plan to revamp the Venezuelan oil and gas sector. There will likely be a lot of obstacles to that, and the plan may not work, but that could become an opportunity for U.S. oil majors there. Venezuela has a lot of mineral riches as well, from gold to diamonds to...
Yeah, it's ridiculously wealthy in natural resources. Yeah,
exactly. But we can also think about other countries with like Argentina with natural gas in Vaca Muerta. There is Paraguay that has cheap energy and can become a hub for data centers.
Right.
So there are...
sorry to interrupt, but I mean, is there an interest in Latin and South America in this Monroe Doctrine? Like, hey, if America were to say, yeah, we're gonna take as much of our manufacturing away from China and Asia as we can, and invest it in Latin and South America, are there countries there saying, yeah, let's do that? Like, I'll raise my hand.
Yeah, basically in Latin America, historically, what we have is governments that do not have enough resources to develop their own industries, and that they rely on foreign investment to do so. So, of course, there is issues like corruption, regulatory obstacles, a lot of protectionism in some countries like Brazil and Argentina are very protectionist because they don't want to open their manufacturing sectors to foreign competition, because that could lead to the bankruptcy and the collapse of their own domestic sectors. But aside all of these obstacles, the countries are open to foreign investment. What we have seen over the past decades is that China has become the main source of foreign direct investment in basically all of South America and many countries in South America as well. The US, given the much closer link to the region for centuries, is still when you look about what we call the stock, so what has been invested over time, the US still is the leader. So a lot of US companies are present here. They still have an influence on policy making because they are able to lobby. So they do not oppose that. The issue with the Monroe Doctrine is not that it can bring cooperation, is the way that the relationship is established, that it's much more around coercion and pressure rather than cooperation. Prior to what we are seeing as this resurgence, and a lot of people are calling the Dawn role because of Donald Trump, the kind of one of the main principles of the US foreign policy was what they called shared prosperity, was the idea, exactly as you're saying, that through cooperation and investment, if US companies or US resources would improve the quality of life, improve the economic conditions in the countries in the region, people would be more inclined to stay in their countries because they have a better life, they have a better prospect, than emigrate, for instance, to the US illegally.
Right.
So that was a way to frame the relationship that focused more on cooperation rather than coercion. Now what we'll likely see is more like the threats of tariffs, the threats of sanctions, and even perhaps military threat as a way to get the countries in the region to stick to Washington's interests.
And I guess TBD, it was more carrot. Now the stick's getting introduced. Will it be more stick going forward, or is this just an interim time to get everybody to line up and then it goes back to more carrots? TBD. There's a lot of discussion here in the live chat about Taiwan and its semiconductor importance to the U.S. And what I'm wondering, and this is just me thinking in real time aloud here, is, if indeed that this is the vision of the U.S., unite the Western Hemisphere in the way that the Monroe Doctrine sort of envisions. Could Trump be talking to Russia and talking to China and saying, hey guys, say whatever you need to say publicly about what I just did here. And by the way, I'm not going to let you get, a real permanent foothold in Latin America. You're just going to have to suck it up. But Russia, I'm working with you to end the Ukraine war. You're going to end up with a big chunk of Ukraine, right? China, I know you want Taiwan. I'll let you have it eventually. Just give me 5 or 10 years so that we can build our own, domestic chip manufacturing to the point where we're not so dependent on Taiwan. Do you think there's some of that backdoorism going on, saying, hey, yeah, everybody can kind of own their part of the world here now?
Yeah, I think it's less of an open and blunt kind of statement, but that's what the indications and the acts transpire, right? So even though the US or US officials or Trump are not necessarily saying, as you framed this, as you kind of phrased out loud, that's the kind of the messaging that the other sides start to understand, perhaps act upon. So of course, it's early to say that that's what the outcome will actually be, and that either Russia or China will take decisive action and do similar military operations targeting the leaders of Ukraine or Taiwan. It's not necessarily that outcome, but the perception that the world order is changing and it's giving them more room to exert influence in their kind of own backyard, so to speak. Okay.
Mario, I'm looking at the time. We got about 7 minutes until the hour. I've still got a few questions, and I'd love to grab some from the audience. Can you go a little bit long, or do we have a hard stop at the hour?
I could go like 10 more minutes, maybe.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's talk about Venezuela's oil industry here. So it's a little debated because of the quality of the oil, but it's sort of globally accepted that Venezuela has the greatest oil reserves in the world. A lot of it's really heavy crude, super heavy crude even. Good news for the US, though, is we have refineries that specialize in that. So if we are now essentially taking over the running of Venezuela's oil industry, and saying, hey, maybe at some point in time, Venezuela, we give it back to you, but for the foreseeable future, we're going to run it. We're going to revitalize it. We're going to dramatically increase the output. You're going to benefit. Our companies that are doing this are going to benefit. We're also going to make sure that Venezuelan oil doesn't get to our enemies the way that it was, right? You said it was 4% of China's oil imports. What's the import of this? And how fast can this be brought up to a notably greater production than it is today? I've heard a lot in the past couple of days of manage your expectations because this infrastructure is pretty creaky and rusty.
Exactly. I think that's one of the main challenges. We saw reports yesterday and today that the Trump administration will have meetings with oil companies, executives on Friday. And that's what Trump outlined in the press conference, that the idea is that you bring in private sector money to rebuild the infrastructure of the Venezuelan oil sector. And from there, of course, since Venezuela has 17% of the world's reserves, you can just get oil pumping, and that would pay for their investments, that would pay for compensations for prior expropriations that happened in Venezuela, and that would be a way that everyone is able to make money and kind of be happy with it, so to speak. But as you said, there are operational challenges because the oil is actually super heavy, so it's not cost efficient. The cost of extraction is higher than in other areas and other types of oil. You have a scenario in which companies, given the current low oil prices, they are not at a moment in which they are willing to carry out large investments. So even putting Venezuela aside, regular projects, this is a moment of much more constraint from a budgetary perspective than of investing large sums of money.
Right.
If you think that there are like third-party data showing that it would take $110 billion to rebuild the Venezuelan oil infrastructure, and it will likely take between 10 to 15 years to get production, etc., to get to a significant increase, to say double production, or at maybe get like 3 times higher than what it is today, which is what it had in the early 2000s. So we're talking about a lot of money and kind of a long time frame. And the long time frame is important because that would require a stable political environment. So a company is comfortable with injecting that large sum and kind of believe that we'll just reap the benefits a decade down the road, a decade and a half. And that's not the scenario we have in Venezuela right now. We have, of course, Maduro has been removed, you have a new president, but as we were discussing earlier, she can be ousted by the military. She can face protests for being too friendly to the US. There could be a transition to democracy and the opposition gets to power, but is not able to govern. There can be an armed conflict. So this kind of wide range of scenarios of high uncertainty, they are also constraints for companies to invest. And then just to wrap, even from a legal perspective, you could get US companies access to Venezuelan oil and gas assets. Let's say the Venezuelan government allows that. But a lot of those assets that are currently sanctioned, the companies don't have the authorization from the US Treasury Department to operate. But the assets there belong to other companies. There are companies from Russia, from China, from other countries, from Europe even, that they hold stakes in oil fields. Let's say the government can just say, okay, I'm handing over to US companies. This could easily become a matter of litigation in international courts. Or even the fear that, well, now Trump is in power, the Venezuelan government agreed, they start investing, and then let's say Trump leaves office, there is a military coup in Venezuela, and then the new government just nationalizes it all over again.
All over again, yeah.
Yeah, so like for a private company, it's a kind of high stakes scenario to follow through with this plan. So that's why we see that these constraints will significantly limit the outlook that this will actually be a successful effort.
Okay, so Cliff here asks, it's being reported on U.S. news that U.S. oil companies were not consulted on taking control of Venezuela oil. Oil executives saying the cost is over 200 billion investment required. So it can be debated, 100 billion, 200 billion. First off, do you know whether or not they were consulted or not about this beforehand?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be the case that there was a formal consultation. There were reports in December that the Trump administration was having informal conversations, but this is not the case that, for example, they had a plan, that they outlined the plan and that the companies had agreed to it. It doesn't seem to be the case indeed. Even so that the reports, the more recent reports, is that on Friday there will be a meeting between Trump officials, Trump himself, with oil executives. So certainly this is not something that there has been an agreement upon as of now.
Okay. So Cliff then follows up with a question that says, well, what if the oil companies say thanks, but no thanks? What I have heard, and I can't imagine this wouldn't have to be part of the solution, is that a lot of the build out's going to be subsidized initially by the U.S. government. And Trump has actually mentioned this directly and said, there could be various ways in which the U.S. could be reimbursed from that, either out of future profits or whatever. But that, to your point, the companies, which of course, if they can make money, they'll do it happily. A good chunk of the lifting might be done by the government financially to make this happen. Let me ask you this, Mario. So let's assume for a moment that things don't go well with Venezuela and U.S. relations from here, but possession is 9/10 of the law. U.S. is now running Venezuela's oil infrastructure, at least its offshore oil infrastructure. The threat the U.S. always has is, hey, you do anything to sabotage what we're doing here, and we're just going to rain, military hellfire down on you. So could there be if things went sour, do you envision one of the more likely options would be that you've got a country, but its oil reserves offshore are run by another country that is basically saying, don't mess with us, or else you're going to regret it?
Yeah, I think there could be a kind of...
Let's hope it doesn't get to that stage, but is that how it might play out?
There could be different arrangements, but more likely, if it comes to a scenario in which the current government is not willing to cooperate or things don't play out, it's more likely that the U.S. will put pressure to then get to regime change than to operate. Because the issue is that in Venezuela, a lot of the oil are in the Orinoco River oil belt. So the Orinoco oil belt in Orinoco is a river. So they're not necessarily offshore, they are inland.
Okay.
So it's not just that you can have vessels and naval ships kind of protecting offshore assets. There is offshore production, but it's not just offshore. So it's not as simple as having a government in place and having the oil infrastructure aside from it.
Okay. All right. Well, look, folks, if you've got any other questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat here, and I'll ask them in the last couple of minutes we have here with Mario. Mario, is there anything that's on your radar that I haven't thought to ask you about in terms of this very fluid situation?
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground here, just in terms of the scenarios that we have. We have outlined 5 scenarios for how we see the situation likely evolving. And then if you want, I can just very briefly outline them just to have in mind how things can play out. And one is in which the new president cooperates with the US and remains in power. Again, we are talking about 3 to 6 months. There is a scenario in which she defies Washington, then the US resumes the military campaign, and then this is a very uncertain scenario because you don't know if the regime stands.
Yep.
There is one that the hardliners oust the president, consolidate power, and then there is kind of this tension with the US. The 4th scenario is basically the regime collapsing. Rather than a regime change, the regime collapsing. You have infighting, you have different groups controlling parts of the military and paramilitary apparatus, and then this just evolves to an internal armed conflict and basically chaos.
Okay, so
And
that's the failed state scenario, right?
exactly, that's a failed
Yeah.
state scenario. And then the least likely is a scenario in which there is a transition, a democratic transition, and the opposition takes power. And this is very unlikely, especially when we think about a shorter time frame. This could happen further down the line, but for now, it's still highly unlikely.
Okay. All right. There was a funny question here for you. What's the U.S. going to do about all those drugs flooding our country from Greenland? And I know that's being said sarcastically, but you and I talked super briefly before we turned the camera on, Mario. I would actually, to the extent there is interest, and so folks indicate in the live chat or in the comments if you're watching the replay how interested you are. I'd be happy to reach out to RANE and get someone on from your North America team to talk about the situation with Greenland, and certainly post Venezuela, the administration's been dialing up its past chest beating, saying that it wants to annex Greenland one way or the other. So I guess I'll work with you and your colleagues to set that up if indeed folks are interested. But just real quick, Mario, a lot of people kind of roll their eyes when Greenland comes up, but I don't think RANE thinks that it's a laughable issue, meaning that there probably is something that's going on there, and there probably is something that's going to happen there at some point.
Yeah, definitely. I think that when this first came up, everyone was like, how serious is the Trump administration being about this? And what we have seen since, and especially after the developments with Venezuela, is that the Trump administration is willing to take risk and is willing to adopt measures that in the past were considered improbable, disruptive, but to exert and to put in practice what it has outlined as its national security strategy to defend the national interest. And then, of course, when you think of Greenland, its strategic position in the Arctic, how it connects to Russia, to China, to kind of mineral resources. And then when you think about the Europeans and NATO, so it's a highly contentious issue. And I'm sure one of my colleagues would be happy to delve into that, because it's certainly enough to discuss for over an hour again.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you. And look, I don't know much about this, so I'm looking forward to getting educated by your analyst there. And I don't mean to sound callous, but I kind of think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there's just certain lines that the country is just not going to accept, right? Okay, we're not going to accept Russian nukes right off our shores, right? Where if the U.S., forget Trump specifically for a second, got to the point where it said, look, we're just too strategically vulnerable to our adversaries on some part of the North America, some part of our hemisphere. We can't let that stand. And yeah, we want to be nice guys, but if we're talking about 50,000 people, surely we can either come to some arrangement where we make them all millionaires, and everybody's happy, or if not, we find some way to be. I guess my point is, we're not going to let 50,000 people get in the way of protecting our what we consider to be a vulnerability in a key flank.
Yeah, indeed, that seems to be the position of at least some people inside the administration, and that they are willing to act under that premise.
Okay. All right. Well, look, Mario, I can't thank you enough. These updates are so useful and valuable, especially in such a fluid situation. I would love to have you back on again in the future. I'm gonna hope, don't take this personally, I'm gonna hope it's not soon, in the sense that I hope we're not reacting to some unfortunate new development like a coup inside the country or something like that. But obviously, anything material that happens, I would love to have you back on this channel to do this again for the audience.
Yeah, it would be a pleasure to join you again, and it's always great to have these conversations. So thanks for having me.
All right. Well, folks, please express your thanks to Mario for coming on and doing this for us. Please also hit that like button and click on the subscribe button below if you haven't already, as well as that little bell icon. Mario, for folks that would like to follow you in your work in between now and your next appearance on this channel, where should they go?
Yeah, we can always reach out to RANE at ranenetwork.com or reach out to the email info@ranenetwork.com.
All right, fantastic. Mario, thanks so much for doing this. Thanks for going a bit late. Always super useful and valuable. Really appreciate it, my friend.
My pleasure.
All right, and everybody else, thanks so much for watching.
I think we've got another 5 to 10 years in gold.
At best, the currency we have up today is going to last another decade. And I mean, at best, I really don't think it's going to last that long at all. So whilst we're still in the currency system we're in, I believe we're going to see the gold price, the silver price pushing higher and higher and higher. And then at some point, there's going to be a crisis, a monetary crisis, an interest rate crisis, a bond crisis, a currency crisis. We don't know what it will be. And at that point, we'll start with a new currency of some description or restrictions of what you can do with your old currency. And at that point, we go back into a new system with a new dollar or a new pound or a gold-backed currency. We don't know exactly how it's going to look. It might be the central bank digital currency where you've got restrictions on how much of your old currency you can put into the CBDC. Whatever it is, until we get to that new system, the gold price and the silver price, I think, has to go higher because there's literally more government debt coming into the planet, and that means someone else is getting that money, and they have to invest that money somewhere. And the more this government debt expands, the more they're going to choose an inflation hedge like gold.
Gold and silver remain in a long-term bull market, driven by central bank buying, ETF accumulation, and rising debt that prompts investors to seek inflation hedges. While gold still has another 5 to 10 years left in its bull market, analysts like Mario Inaco and Clive Thompson believe prices will continue to climb until a major crisis, whether driven by monetary, geopolitical, or systemic forces, forces a reset into a new currency system. Until then, market sentiment suggests continued gains and a potential final explosive rally within the next decade. The speaker, Mario Inaco, a financial market expert, mentions that Bert Doman, founder of Doman Capital, conducted a long-term cycle study of gold reaching back centuries. He identified a 20-year bear market that started in 1980, which ended around 2000, followed by a secular 30-year bull market that began in 2001. Based on this, he believes the current gold bull could continue through 2030 to 2031. The narrative of a prolonged upward trend amid systemic financial pressures finds strong consensus among many observers. Based on this, it is concluded that gold still has another 5 to 10 years remaining in its bull market. Clive Thompson notes that the bull market in precious metals is likely to continue until a new dollar, pound, or gold-backed currency, or a central bank digital currency, replaces the current currency system. Until then, rising government debt and recurring monetary, bond, or geopolitical crises will continue to drive investors toward inflation hedges. The excerpts from the interview are now available. Please click the bell symbol to receive timely updates, and subscribe to our channel before we continue our conversation. Thank you, and have fun watching the video.
I think we've got another 5 to 10 years in gold. So yeah, in the commodities bull market. Why do I say that? Well, I listened to Bert Doman. He's a fund manager, and I think he started out in the 70s. He's originally from Germany, but he's US based. And he said that in the 70s, he got his clients into gold in the mid-late 70s, and they did very well. And then in 1980, he told them, you need to get out of gold. We're going to have a 20-year bear market. And everyone thought he was crazy, but he was right. And then he said, but after that, there will be a 32-year bull market. And I think he looked at the price of gold going back a few hundred years in the UK, because the UK and the US are linked, the prices. So if you add 32 to 2000, you get 2032, and that's why I'm looking for another 5 years at least. But I think Jim Sinclair used to say that the next move higher in gold, let's say, it's not going to be like in 1980, because we went up to like almost 900, and then the next 20 years, we drifted between 250 and 400. He thinks it's going to stay up there next time. It's going to be different. So I'll let Clive answer that.
Well, I think the bull market, if you like, if we could call it bull market in precious metals, continues until such time as the currency has to be replaced by sound money. So how long does it continue? I think at best, the currency we have up today is going to last another decade. And I mean, at best, I really don't think it's going to last that long at all. So whilst we're still in the currency system we're in, I believe we're going to see the gold price, the silver price pushing higher and higher and higher. And then at some point, there's going to be a crisis, a monetary crisis, an interest rate crisis, a bond crisis, a currency crisis. We don't know what it will be, or it'll be some external crisis, whether it be war or civil war or some event that we're not expecting, some black swan event. But these things come along and they'll be pushed into a situation where people are running to the shops to get anything which will preserve its value. And at that point, we'll start with a new currency of some description or restrictions of what you can do with your old currency. And at that point, we go back into a new system with a new dollar or a new pound or a gold-backed currency. We don't know exactly how it's going to look. It might be the central bank digital currency where you've got restrictions on how much of your old currency you can put into the CBDC. Whatever it is, until we get to that new system, the gold price and the silver price, I think, has to go higher because there's literally more government debt coming into the planet, and that means someone else is getting that money, and they have to invest that money somewhere. And the more this government debt expands, the more they're going to choose an inflation hedge like gold.
Rafi, in the interview with Clive and Mario, recalls that the gold to CRB ratio indicates gold's value relative to other commodities. Since 2000, it has been in a clear bull trend, despite occasional pullbacks. The 2020 oil crash, when prices briefly went negative, sent the ratio into an extreme spike. However, since gold and silver bottomed in 2022, the ratio has been climbing again. Currently, the chart suggests we're halfway through this significant upswing. Unlike during the lockdowns, oil and other commodities are not depressed. Yet, gold is still rising strongly, indicating solid momentum in its ongoing bull market. However, Mario, along with Clive Thompson, notes that with the global adoption of Basel III capital rules now underway in the U.S., allocated physical gold is formally recognized as a Tier 1 asset, on par with cash and treasuries. This institutional shift underpins the demand for gold, reinforcing its status as a financial backstop amid potential changes to the monetary regime. Governments are rapidly developing central bank digital currencies. The EU is fast-tracking its digital euro proposal to counter the growing dominance of US-linked stablecoins, while China is expanding international use of its e-Chinese yuan and considering yuan-backed stablecoins for cross-border trade. The UK is also developing a digital pound, with consumer usage expected in the late 2020s. Now, let's have an insight into the interview.
So this is the gold to CRB ratio. All right, so it goes back all the way to 2000, but I picked 2010 here just so you could see.
Yeah.
This is if we're in a gold bull market, then this is the value of gold in terms of other commodities. The higher it is, the higher the gold value is relative to other commodities. So, and we've been in a bull market since 2000, but there've been major pullbacks. Right, this is 2022 when gold and silver bottomed. I think silver bottomed at like $16 or something like that, maybe a little bit more. And we've been climbing ever since then. This was the oil, the lockdowns when oil went to negative 35, so that's why it went so high here. But like we're about halfway up this spike when the lockdowns happened, when oil went to negative. So if we're about halfway up this major spike, which was an all-time high, and other oil is not anywhere near negative now because the economy isn't shut down. So gold is it's going pretty fast now.
Well, we do take long-term mortgages, but the rates are set short-term, like 2 and 5 years. So they are based on the like 2-year swap rate, they call it, and the 5-year. But I think long-term rates, they've been going up a lot. They're making like highs, 27-year highs, like the 10-year, well, the 30-year yield. And what that will do is that's going to hurt the government. That's going to increase the deficit. That's going to inflate things even more. And I think the Bank of England is going to have a tough time cutting the short-term rate. So even though in the UK we don't use the 10 and 30-year rates to set mortgages, I think things are going to remain tough. Clive?
Well, banks, when they lend money for a mortgage, whether it's in the UK or any other country, they are effectively lending that money out for the next 20 or 30 years because they're not realistically expecting anyone to repay the mortgage in the next 6 months. So, of course, long-term rates have to have an effect on the interest rate they're going to charge you on the mortgage. Yes, there's an influence in the UK because they set the rate in some way to the 2 or 6 or 5 year term, and then it gets rolled over at a higher rate regularly. But at the end of the day, if long rates are pushing higher, the banks have got to have their heads screwed on and say, well, we've got to charge our customers a little bit more, because at the end of the day, the alternative, we don't have to lend the customers the money on their mortgage. We could go and put the money into a 30-year bond, which is effectively the same thing, instead of lending it to my customer. So if the 30-year bond rates were to go to, say, 7%, you won't be able to, I don't think you'll be able to get a mortgage for less than 7, for sure.
Rafi, you got an opinion on that?
Yeah, so what Clive is saying makes logical sense. If a bank can lend the money to the government with much less risk than it can lend to somebody for a mortgage, with a much lower default risk to the government, obviously, then whether 30-year mortgage rates officially set mortgages or unofficially doesn't make that much of a difference. It makes a little bit of a difference, maybe in short-term fluctuations and stuff, but there shouldn't be too much of a spread between 30. I mean, there shouldn't be more 30-year mortgage rates shouldn't be substantially lower than 30-year bond rates. It shouldn't be lower at all, but if it is lower, it shouldn't be that. It definitely shouldn't be that much lower. So yeah, their mortgages are set by long-term rates, either formally or informally.
Gold and silver remain firmly in a long-term bull market supported by systemic pressures, central bank accumulation, and the institutional recognition of gold as a Tier 1 asset. With CBDCs on the horizon and financial uncertainty growing, precious metals are positioned not only as hedges but as anchors in a shifting monetary system. Meanwhile, miners' renewed strength suggests the bull market is still in its early phase, with significant upside potential if gold prices hold above current levels. Do you think the rise of CBDCs will accelerate demand for physical gold as a parallel store of value? Could gold miners finally see a sustained re-rating, or will they continue to be a niche play despite strong fundamentals? Please feel free to express your opinions in the comments section below. If you found this helpful content, please remember to subscribe to remain updated and to give it a thumbs up. Thank you for joining us on this journey.
I would not be surprised to see silver gap above $40. It never touched $40 in U.S. market hours on Friday. But I would not be surprised to just see silver gap above $40 and just have a big move up on Tuesday. So I would go to Shift Gold now or tomorrow and get some silver. Don't wait for that big move up, because by the time the ETF buyers have a shot, they can be looking at much higher prices. Same thing with gold. I mean, maybe gold will gap up. I'd love to see gold gap above 3,500. That would be something. That's going to be that's a bigger move, because that's about a $50 move for gold to do that. But there's so much that's going on right now, fundamentally, technically, that would support that kind of breakaway gap in these metals.
Gold hit a more than 4-month high on Monday, as increased bets for a U.S. Federal Reserve interest rate cut this month lifted bullion's allure, while silver rose above $40 per ounce for the first time in more than a decade. Peter Schiff expects a strong move higher, possibly as early as Tuesday, and advises buying silver now before prices jump, since ETF buyers might face much higher levels. The same goes for gold. If it gaps above $3,500, that would be a significant $50 move, supported by both strong fundamentals and technical momentum that could trigger a breakout. Peter Schiff, an American stockbroker, financial commentator, and author, highlights that gold appears to be entering its next big rally, likely beginning when it broke above prior highs on Friday, setting the stage for a quick move toward $3,500. As of early Asian trading on Sunday, it was around $3,448 after briefly topping $3,450. Silver also hit a 13-year high Friday, closing just shy of $40, and is now trading near $39.72. Both metals look technically and fundamentally strong, helped by a weaker dollar index, which closed below 98. The U.S. bank holiday is contributing to thinner liquidity, which is also exacerbating some of the moves in gold and silver. Silver is making a move higher in response to expectations of lower U.S. rates, while a tight supply market is helping to maintain an upward bias. Peter Schiff recalls predicting a golden age for gold during Trump's presidency, noting that while Bitcoin is being promoted as digital gold, it has underperformed, trading below its prior peak despite hype, ETFs, and official support. Gold, by contrast, is hitting record highs, far outpacing Bitcoin and stocks. They warn that Bitcoin looks like a pump-and-dump scheme and suggest converting it into gold or silver instead. Let's dive into Schiff's video for more insights. If you find the content engaging, please consider giving us a positive review and subscribing to our channel to receive the latest updates.
Gold, I think, is finally getting ready for the next leg up. In fact, it probably started that leg up on Friday by going through the highs. But now I think we've got clear sailing to get up to 3,500. I think we'll pass that relatively quickly. In fact, I'll take a look at where we're trading right now. Early Sunday evening, so Asian trading is just kind of kicked off. And in the gold market, let me pull that up. Yeah, no, gold's down about 90 cents, 3,448. A few minutes ago, it was trading above 34.50. Silver also on Friday. Silver closed at a 13-year high. We came within 10 cents of $40. Right now, we're trading at 39.72, which is up about a dime from where we closed on Friday. But both gold and silver looking very strong, technically, fundamentally. The dollar was also weak on the week. Dollar index closed back below 98, about 97.80. So weakness in the dollar also working to help the gold market. But I think there are major, fundamental stories that are going to be fueling this gold market rally. I said it on this podcast when Donald Trump gave his first speech as president and announced the golden age in America. I said he's right in a literal sense. It was going to be a golden age for gold. And so far, gold is off to its best start probably of any presidency in history. Trump may not be making America great again, but he's making gold great again, not by intention, but the unintended consequence of his policies, right? He's trying to tout Bitcoin. Bitcoin is only up about 14% on the year, right? Gold is killing it. In fact, Bitcoin is 13% below its peak, right? Clearly, it's not digital gold. Gold's making a new record high. Bitcoin's in a correction. It could easily enter a new bear market pretty soon. And of course, the stock market is, gold stocks are crushing the returns in Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is still today about 13% lower than it was at its peak 4 years ago if you price it in gold. So despite all the hype, all the Bitcoin ETFs, the Bitcoin treasury companies, the strategic Bitcoin reserve, America being the Bitcoin capital of the world with the first Bitcoin president, Bitcoin is still lower than it was before any of that stuff happened. So how is that possible? How can all this good news and all this new buying not drive the price higher? Because there's a lot of people smarter than the people who are buying who have been selling into all the hype. This is a gigantic pump and dump that's going on with Bitcoin. And the big pumpers now are the Trump administration, and all of their friends are the dumpers. But if you're smart, you'll get rid of what Bitcoin you have, and you'll go down to Shift Gold, where we work with BitPay, and you'll take your Bitcoin and you'll buy some gold or you'll buy some silver. This is a holiday weekend, so the U.S. markets are closed on Monday. I would not be surprised to see silver gap above $40. It never touched $40 in U.S. market hours on Friday. But I would not be surprised to just see silver gap above $40 and just have a big move up on Tuesday. So I would go to Shift Gold now or tomorrow and get some silver. Don't wait for that big move up, because by the time the ETF buyers have a shot, they could be looking at much higher prices. Same thing with gold. I mean, maybe gold will gap up. I'd love to see gold gap above 3,500. That would be something. That's a bigger move, because that's about a $50 move for gold to do that. But there's so much that's going on right now, fundamentally, technically, that would support that kind of breakaway gap in these metals.
Peter recalls how mainstream financial media often ignored gold, even when it was making major moves. He remembers being on CNBC years ago when gold had risen about $40. To him, that attitude showed a lack of understanding, because gold isn't just a commodity, it's money. Historically, even Alan Greenspan used gold as a key measure of monetary policy, warning that high prices signaled excessive looseness. Today, with gold around $3,450, it's clear that monetary policy has been far too loose for decades. Central banks themselves treat gold as the most important asset, stockpiling it while shunning other commodities. Rising gold prices, Peter Schiff argues, are a warning sign of deep economic problems in America, yet many still dismiss it while hyping Bitcoin instead. He stresses that central banks, the insiders of the fiat system, are effectively dumping dollars in favor of gold, signaling a loss of confidence in paper money. Investors should follow their lead by shifting into gold, silver, and international value stocks, which are already seeing strong returns as money flows out of U.S. assets. Now let's dive into the interview.
They barely talked about gold, as gold was making all-time record highs. I still remember when I went on CNBC back when they still had me on. I hadn't been on like 10 years. I don't know. I can't remember when I was on. But when I used to be on every week, but when I first started going on, I was on Squawk Box, and the host was this guy, Mark Haynes, who passed away quite some time ago now. But the first time I was on, of course, I discussed the price of gold, and I think it was still below 300, or maybe it was in the low 300s. I forget. But I came back, I don't know, a few weeks later, and I'm in the studio again talking to Mark Haynes. And I said, Mark, gold's up about $40 since the last time I was in this studio. And his response to me was, who cares? Who cares about the price of gold? And, he mentioned a number of things where he cares about the price. But he says, I forget, maybe it was bread or oil, I forget. But he said, why should I care about the price of gold? Right? He is the anchor in a financial news show. It's supposed to be focusing on finance, investing, economics. And he says, who cares about the price of gold? I mean, how could you not care about the price of gold? Only if you just don't understand what gold is. I mean, gold is money. It's you're a show about money. How could you not care about gold? And when the price of gold is going up, especially like this, it is a warning. It is telling you that there's a problem, right? I mean, even Alan Greenspan, I talked about this, he used to use gold as his primary reference to know whether or not he was too loose or too tight. He used to say that if gold gets up near 400, I'm too loose. If it goes below 300, I'm too tight. Now, what does that say? Look where we are now, 34.50. We've been too loose for decades based on Greenspan's metric. But the gold is the most important price. It's not just a precious metal. It's not just a commodity. It's a monetary metal. Central banks are holding gold for a reason, right? How could you say, I don't care about the price of gold? Well, what about all these central banks that are hoarding all this gold? Don't you think that's significant? Because they're not stockpiling other commodities. They're owning gold for a reason. It is the single most important price out there. And right now it is screaming that there is a huge problem. There is something rotten in the state of America. And that's what you're seeing in the gold market. And, I'm sure that mentality still exists today. The same one that Mark Haynes had, even though he's not around anymore. I think that idea that who cares about the price of gold, right? What's the big deal? It's nothing, right? It's just a rock, right? They care a lot more about Bitcoin than they do about gold. But if you understand what gold is saying, it is a warning. And it's a warning that you had better heed and that you better react to. You better get out of dollars. You better get into gold and silver. That's what the central banks are doing, right? Follow their lead, right? They ought to know. They're like the insiders in the fiat money system, right? So if you see in a company, if all the managers are dumping their shares, they might know something that you don't. Well, this is basically what's happening. The managers of the fiat monetary system are dumping their dollars. They want out. And they're buying gold. They're not buying other currencies. They don't want another fiat currency. They want real money. You should do the same thing. And the same thing is happening with investors. Not necessarily in gold, but they're dumping their U.S. shares and they're buying back their own stock. Right? That's why, my dividend payers fund is almost up 40% on the year now. It's at 39%. It's on the high of the year because value international dividend paying stocks, that's where people are putting their money now. That's where when they sell in their U.S. stocks and they sell their dollars, they're bringing their money home and they're buying value. They're buying income, right? They're buying these dividend paying stocks. I think we're still early in this trend.
Gold and silver are showing clear signs of entering powerful new rallies, with central banks and investors driving demand while the dollar weakens. Peter Schiff emphasizes that gold's record highs are not just a market trend but a warning of deeper economic issues tied to excessive money printing and debt. He argues that unlike Bitcoin, which he views as speculative hype, gold and silver remain true stores of value and the assets central banks themselves trust. For investors, the message is clear: follow the smart money into precious metals before the next breakout accelerates. Do you think gold's rally toward $3,500 will trigger broader recognition of it as the ultimate safe haven? With silver nearing $40, could this be the start of a long-awaited move into triple-digit prices? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more updates. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
I think we'll see new highs in the next 12 months. And I think we'll retest the highs in the next 6 months. So retesting meaning 50 in the next 6 and then breaking out to new highs in the next 12 months. I could be wrong on the timing, but it certainly seems like that's a very intriguing timeline to follow because of the volume we're seeing of purchases post days of declines. We're seeing clearly the outperformance of silver even when gold is falling. And the reaction that even technical analysts that tend to push these movements from a momentum standpoint are beginning to see the probably greatest cup and handle we've seen in history that is still not, have not ended. We still need to see the other side of that handle really break out.
The silver will retest its previous high of around $50 within the next 6 months and likely break out to new record highs within a year. While the exact timing could vary, the outlook is supported by strong buying activity on market dips, silver's resilience compared to gold, and technical patterns, particularly what may be the largest cup and handle formation ever observed, that suggests a powerful breakout is still ahead. Tavi Costa is a macro investor and portfolio manager at Crescat Capital, best known for his deep research on commodities, precious metals, and global macro trends. The classic cup and handle pattern starts with a massive price surge, like what happened in silver during the 1970s, followed by a peak in the 1980s and then a long period of decline and loss of confidence that lasted about 20 years. That long downturn marked the bottom of the market, and by the early 2000s, silver began another cycle, eventually retesting its previous highs. Each time prices return to those old highs, selling pressure often increases because investors fear a repeat of the past. However, the recent decline in silver wasn't as deep as the crash of the 1980s, and the industry has recovered more steadily this time. Now, silver is once again pushing toward its historic $50 peak, and with so much momentum behind it, many believe a breakout is coming. In markets, there's a saying that there's no such thing as triple tops, suggesting silver won't stall out again, but instead move higher once it clears resistance. For investors, the takeaway is clear: prepare for the possibility of much higher silver prices, but the broader setup strongly favors silver's long-term upside. As we present clips from the video, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell to stay instantly notified every time we upload a new video. Thanks for the support, and enjoy the video.
If you think of how a cup and handle is formed, initiates with a large movement that is usually unprecedented, which happened in the 70s, and then peaked in the 80s. And then you have this complete loss of faith and a peak of a bubble. And that goes on for a long time, 20 years or so, of which was the case until the late 90s. And after we saw that, that was the very bottom of that market. So we went all the way up and created the beginning of another cycle, which was the early 2000s, until we retested the highs of the prior bubble. And so investors look at those two things and say, well, that looks like, that same issue we had in the past. And so the selling becomes more pronounced at those levels. And it's normal to see that type of pressure creating another long-term decline. The difference is that this decline wasn't, although it was very difficult for those invested in this industry. I wasn't involved with the industry personally, but I clearly that decline really shaped the industry in a big way as well. But it wasn't as deep and steep as we saw in the 80s. So that decline, although marked, in a huge way, the history of silver, it was definitely, much easier to stomach relative to the 80s. And so now, we're seeing another movement to push again to that same level that we saw the peak of the bubble in prior times. The thing is, there's so much energy behind this to see the price breaking out. There's a joke that we say in markets, there's no such thing as triple tops. And there we have it, approaching a triple top. There's going to be maybe a moment where we hit that 50, and nobody knows if that's going to be the case. But there's a very high likelihood that we may hit the 50 and people will say, well, that might be it. We might hit a peak here. I don't think that will be the case because cup and handles break out. And so we may see a short-term movement. This is why I said 6 months to get to 50, 12 months to break it through it. But I do think, regardless of the timing of how this whole thing will resolve, I think the resolution is we're going to see much higher prices. So if you're investing in the space and you have that view, you can apply that in markets. Look at if you're running a mining company, you can see this. All right, well, there's a clear path that we may see a break of silver prices. What is my biggest risk here? One, that I'm wrong. You could always be wrong. But two, how do I secure my margin? Because that's the biggest thing. That's your biggest treasury. So this is why I'm urging people in the space to say, protect your margin, because your biggest risk right now is energy. It's not the stock market, it's energy. And in some cases, investors may have issues with maybe labor costs and others. And so it depends on the structure of your cost. But usually energy is about 30% of your cost, particularly coming from open pit projects. And so, yeah, that's the way I'm envisioning this whole thing. And as an investor, if you are in that side of the market, then, act accordingly. Think about companies that will be in a great position if prices reach those levels, and plan for that. Really try to plan for it. And yeah, that's the way I invest. That's the way I do my things. And if things change and the plans change, and there's another pandemic or something along those lines come, and we have a major change in markets, sure, I'm allowed to change my views. But having a plan is important. And so that's how I'm trying to approach this.
Tavi Costa explains that gold has led precious metals and hard assets for a while, but markets often rotate leadership between commodities. Although gold functions more like a currency, it has acted as a commodity and signaled the start of a long-term bull cycle in the sector. Recently, however, other metals and related assets have begun outperforming gold. Tavi relates this situation to April 21st. Gold has moved mostly sideways, while the TSX Venture, heavily weighted toward precious metals, rose over 30%, and silver gained double digits. This shows investors are becoming more comfortable with gold and are now moving further along the risk curve, seeking higher returns in less liquid assets like silver and mining stocks. The trend suggests we're entering a phase where other metals catch up to and potentially outperform gold. Moreover, Tavi exposes that we're in what could be called a golden age of mining, as profit margins are exceptionally strong with gold and silver prices far above production costs. However, this may not last forever, so miners should hedge energy costs to lock in profitability. At the same time, the industry faces a major challenge. Reserves are being depleted, few new discoveries are coming online, and exploration budgets remain low, leaving most major miners with very limited replacement reserves. Now, let's just dive into the interview.
Yeah, I do. I think that would be a normal behavior of the metal. We've had, gold really leading the pack of precious metals and hard assets for some time now here, especially in the commodity space. And I think investors that understand the commodities, sector very well will appreciate the fact that there is a rotational dynamic that usually happens where a commodity will take the lead versus another at certain times. And I'm not here to claim that gold is necessarily a commodity. I do view it as a currency, but it acts as a commodity in that case. And I think gold has been signaling that for some time now, that we've seen finally the beginning of a long-term cycle in this whole industry. And we're now what seems to be the beginning of other metals and other derivatives of the gold-related trade or investment starting to outperform gold itself. If you look at the gold price all the way back to just April 21st, when right after the whole situation with tariffs and so forth, the Liberation Days, which happened in the 7th, but gold really peaked in 21st. We've seen gold basically go sideways. And at the same time, we saw the TSX Venture, which marks a lot of especially if you look into the subgroup of precious metals, that whole space was up about 30+% during the same time that gold was basically flat. So, certainly there has been an exercise that I call of acceptance of risk occurring across investors that are looking for the next thing after gold. That doesn't mean gold is going to go away as a trade, but it means that investors are so comfortable with the gold idea that they're starting to go down or go up on the risk curve and go down on the liquidity curve in order to hopefully capture more returns. And I do think that's going to be the case. And so, I'm paying attention to that because silver has also outperformed gold since, silver's up double digits since gold has been basically flat and down, in fact, since April 21st. So all these things are really interesting. And I think that's the beginning of other metals catching up to gold prices finally. We're seeing what I like to call the golden age of mining. mostly because the margins of these companies are just outstanding. And you can see that in many ways, especially looking at the gold to oil ratio, the silver to oil ratio, and obviously looking at the median cost to produce gold today or silver is drastically lower than the actual price of those commodities or those metals. And that's probably, I don't know if that's going to be the case for the long haul, because I do think energy cost is way cheaper than has ever been relative to metals. And so if you're a producer, you definitely want to be making decisions to hedge energy costs if that's a big issue for you as a miner. I think that's a very important point to to hopefully miners will take that strategy as an approach to secure some of those margins over the long haul. We certainly have done that with our own mine, San Cristobal, which is the fourth largest silver mine in the world. We have instructed them to, and they have done it, basically hedge their energy costs for the 3 years out. And I do think that that's, eventually we all know so we were talking about political constraints. Let's talk about industry-wide constraints. One of the largest ones certainly is what we have in terms of the depletion of reserves and no new discoveries coming online. If you think about how many development stories are going to be coming online to become producing assets, it's very small. And also, if you look at the exploration budget across most of the major companies and how much they have found in terms of added ounces, and it's also very small. So the replacement reserve is actually very low today across most of the majors.
Silver appears to be on the verge of a historic breakout, supported by strong technical patterns, resilient fundamentals, and a shift in investor appetite from gold toward higher risk, higher reward assets. Mining companies stand to benefit enormously, but only if they manage costs and secure future reserves. For investors, the setup points to a rare opportunity in both silver and quality miners, though timing and risk management remain key. Do you think silver will finally break above its $50 resistance this cycle, or will history repeat with another stall? How should mining companies balance short-term profitability with the urgent need to replace dwindling reserves? Please leave a remark in the section below with your ideas. Please remember to subscribe to receive updates, and if you find this helpful content, kindly give it a thumbs up. We are grateful that you joined us on this journey.